Alrighty, good morning. This is Axel Merk, President and Chief Investment Officer of Merck Investments. And today's briefing, I held off a little bit to have Fed Chair Powell give his introduction today. Obviously, lots of things happening. The initial jobless claims came out, and then the Federal Reserve announced several more programs, and then Powell speaking. Um, on the initial claims, 6.606, I believe, million new jobless claims. The continuing claims are now moving higher. Obviously, there's a one week lag here on the continuing claims. As a reference point, the U.S. labor force is 164 million, at least was as of February 2020, and so to put those sort of numbers into context. And with the Fed announcements today to have several trillion more in expansion, so to speak, available, most notably expanding things now to give state and municipal governments help by including those sort of securities in its operations. And that's the sort of thing that was expected. The chief investment officer of Credit Suisse today on Bloomberg indicated that these sort of things aren't actually new to the Fed. They have done each one of these in some way or another. That's of course correct to an extent. When the Fed was first created, it was active in the municipal markets as well, and indeed even on the corporate side and the discount window, it's been active, but the scale is definitely unprecedented. And as we also see that the crisis playbook from 2008 was deployed very quickly, and we've gone on from there. And so similarly, should we ever have another crisis, it appears that the current playbook is going to be ramped up very, very quickly based on the experience. So we are setting precedent, and this is going to be very much felt and noted. The Powell in his speech, part of it was to simply communicate with the public. In his opening statement, he said that we're doing all this, and then when it's over, we'll get rid of it all. He was far more qualifying that in his Q&A with David Wessel, where he said that they're in no rush to phase out these programs. They'll do what they did previously in the aftermath of the financial crisis. They'll wait until we are well on the road to recovery and communicate it well as they phase out these programs. So let's just think about what that means for a second. Clearly, right now, the economy is faced with an amazing shock. And that means economic activity is slowing down, but that also means that we see disinflation or deflation, depending on how you want to call it, a lowering of price level in many goods and services. Not in all of them, by the way. I mean, obviously, face masks, for example, are increasing in price. And when you think about inflation during periods of high inflation, it is not as if everything went up by X% based on the CPI at the time. You have a greater dispersion of price movement. So those are early signs and symptoms that we might that there is something happening here that might ultimately lead to broader inflation if one wants to take that tack. Several people have said there's no way we can get inflation out of this. I very much disagree, and let me just make the case for that here for a second. Um, in the short term, that is correct. Now, first of all, the way that consumption is measured is obviously not the sort of baskets we are consuming right now. That has vastly changed. Inflation is supposed to measure our typical consumption basket, and while nobody consumes the average basket, the average is no longer buying cars right now and doing many other things. And so it is in some ways irrelevant that some of these prices go down when that is not the sort of thing that we are consuming right now. And so the bigger the issue, though, is what happens at the tail end of this. We are pumping trillions into this economy. Some people saying we're simply subsidizing things. But of course, the goal is that as the economy gets opened up again, and nobody knows exactly how this will happen. Governor Cuomo of New York said earlier today that he's in no rush to do it. He doesn't want to do it too fast. And so there's going to be this hesitation by many to open up the economy, and with that, that is one reason. If the longer the economy gets shut, the more businesses will fail, and that will not enable many people to get their jobs back. I'm not trying to make a medical judgment here of what is right. I'm just trying to explain the economic implication. And so um, some have said that about half will get their job back and the rest will take longer. That's probably as good as get as any. And of course, these programs that have been put in place, and presumably there's going to be more fiscal stimulus. That said, there also a caution. I would think that it's the partisan bickering is going to come back, and this whatever stimulus is planned might be more difficult. But still, as we push then at the tail end of that, the economy back into higher gear, if we have trillions in additional reserves at the Fed, providing tremendous lending power, and obviously businesses that are around to try to get back up and running, um, there is at least a risk. There is the risk that inflation will go higher, and more importantly than the risk is. If you look at inflation and inflation expectations over the past several decades, the band, the kind of the spread of inflation has been very narrow. Inflation expectations are well anchored, is what economists like to say, and so the opportunity, if you call it such, or the risk is that this anchoring gets dislodged, first with a draft down and then with a jump back higher. And and whether that will be the case or not is of course an open question. But I do think the risk of that happening is there. And as an investor, the way I look at it, at least, and this is not investment advice, and while I do that, I should be giving you some disclosure. So let me show that to you here in between, and then go back here in a second. So investing, in my view, is about taking the potential risks into account that might be happening. It is not about having the perfect prediction. Markets never reflect what is happening. Markets always reflect the kind of the average of potential outcomes and some probability distribution, which is, of course, at the moment you step in the future, is again the probability of something happening at that time in the future. And so it's about taking risk into account. And of course, you might not want to take the tail risk into account because you might just want to focus on that average, that it's on average always 12 o'clock, right? But of course, that's not usually the case. And so the question is whether some of your portfolio or more of your portfolio should take certain scenarios into account. Then briefly, a few other items. Very noteworthy, of course, is aside from the risk on day in the market, is price of gold is up significantly today. The spot price of gold is up 2% as I speak here right now. Very noteworthy this morning is that the spread between the spot and the futures market has again blown out at least being significantly higher than it had been. And that is, we had at the about 2 weeks ago, that was in the news significantly, very much related to the COMEX delivery that COMEX at the time, they've changed it since, they really have used a niche product, not the London bars, but 100-ounce bars and then kilo bars, and then together with shut refineries and clogged logistics channels, and there was a scramble for deliveries. But now, and if I look here, I'm looking up in my Bloomberg screen at the June contract, which is obviously not the current one. There's still the deliveries for April are taking place. Those spreads have blown up, and after we've had a little bit of period of calm, and so there are some disruptions in that market, and it is going to be interesting to see that. Clearly, some of these markets continue to be stressed. One of the things I've been reading out to you is the difference between the Fed funds rate. It's at 0.5. That's 5 basis points. And the 3-month LIBOR, that had been at about 135. It's now at 132. So that's coming down a little bit, but it's still way too high. The 3-month LIBOR market, that's the intrabank London borrowing market for US dollars, is elevated. So there's continued stress in some of these systems. Now, all that said, the Fed is, of course, foaming these things. The one area where money may not be going to as quickly and as fast is the smaller countries, right? I mean, the Fed has a bazooka and can foam the markets, and obviously some other major central banks can do what they can do in their respective countries. The further you go afar, the more likely it is that when if you do borrow money, it is dollar based, and that you don't have access to to dollars, and that's part of the reason you had such major disruption in the currency markets. Some of that has been alleviated also in part, in addition to these swap agreements that the Fed has now, this repo facilities with other central banks where it seems to be less bureaucratic to have access to cash. But the head of the IMF has been making the rounds globally, really pleading that the SDRs of the IMF get supplemented, so that the IMF has more lending powers. And the IMF is talking about hundreds of billions, and while that used to be large amounts of money, we're throwing trillions around in much of the world. And clearly, many of the economies the IMF is helping are much smaller. And so 100 billion, 200 billion, 500 billion gets you much further. But odds are still that those monies might not be as effective. In addition to those, of course, the question is what they are used for. What the Federal Reserve is doing is those are lending facilities, short-term lending against collateral. Whereas what the IMF historically does is they're also giving loans, not grants, but it is not loans against collateral. Usually, it's just a loan to a government, and then of course the government has to deploy those sort of resources. It's a very different transmission mechanism. You really give a loan for a government to ramp up its health infrastructure and whatnot, and obviously there's a reason why some of these governments, talking about smaller countries in emerging markets, don't have good infrastructures. They just don't have things to get ready for the kind of the onslaught of things. We complain a lot in any one country, including, of course, in the US here as well. And oh, we wish that the central government, the Washington, would be more coordinated. But at least in the US, you do have 50 different governors, 50 states that are all taking charge. You have the private sector taking charge. It is impossible in the US to have an approach like you have in Taiwan or South Korea. It just doesn't work with the sort of system that we have. And we can criticize the top all we want. We have to deal that with the cards that we are dealt with. And in the US, you can do that because you have this very decentralized approach to many of these things. Now, can you improve things? Well, obviously, and most certainly with hindsight, you can find a better way of doing it. It gets me back to this issue that in order to fight this virus, perfection is really not needed. What you need is you need to get this reproductive number that hasn't been mentioned as much, less than one. Right now, because some countries have had very few, if any, new cases, I think there's this belief that we can eradicate this virus entirely. I'd be stunned if we can do that. I just don't think that's the base case scenario anybody should be planning on. It is, of course, encouraging that some countries have not had the second waves and so forth, at least not yet. But especially in the US, a very porous country, if we call it as such, where you cannot have a perfect implementation, we have to have a strategy for an imperfect world. And so at the same time, we can't all get locked up forever in our homes. And so we have to find ways. And then on that note, there is a lot of happening right now in various places to try to find out of how to do this. A lot is, and of course, when we look at Taiwan, South Korea, we get spooked about the apps that kind of tell you whether you're going to be in proximity to somebody, and then you have to go into isolation if you walk near somebody. My guess is we'll have a patchwork of solutions, and something that's the social tracking maybe is going to be used on a private basis. I doubt that it's going to be rolled out nationally, but you don't have to go that far. If you look at Taiwan, for example, where everybody is wearing a mask, and I was jogging near Stanford just 2 days ago, I think it was, and they have signs in some buildings that they measure your temperature as you walk in. And so you will have a patchwork of approaches, and some of them will be more effective than others. And my best guess is that over time we'll find the quote unquote best practices. So, question is, we're now at the in the S&P about the 50% retracement, meaning we've recovered about half from the drop from the top. For those watching technical indicators, the question is where we go from here. And again, we really don't know. We have unprecedented multi-trillion-dollar stimuli fiscally and from a monetary point of view. QE historically has pushed up asset prices. Now, that said, uh, nothing can prevent many unemployed people from being unemployed, right? And not getting the job back immediately when the economy backs up. And so there will be a big change in spending. And we often say, hey, the US economy is two-thirds consumer spending. Well, not in 2020, right? Consumer spending less, government is spending more. There will be a distortion in that number. And so maybe the government steps in and so forth, and everybody's going to be happy. Uh, some people have made references to 1929 because there's an eerie similarity in some of the moves in the markets, and there we didn't retest the lows until 1932. Am I predicting we're going to have the same sort of path? Absolutely not. We've never had a supply and demand shock simultaneously. Also, keep in mind in the Great Depression, the the response was very different from monetary and fiscal authorities, and so I don't think we're going to have the same sort of path here. But what I do know is that rules will be changed along the way, and I suppose the kind of the latest announcement from the Fed is just an indication of that. It was kind of anticipated, but it is. There are massive moves that can, by policymakers that can come with an instance notice. So, with that, today is Thursday. Tomorrow is a Good Friday. Markets will be closed, and so I'm going to resume these live updates on Monday, unless something really extraordinary happens, and then kind of tune in on Twitter. I'll personally be working tomorrow, but I'll try to actually get some things done that I don't usually get done. And just speaking for myself, I have been busier than ever, and in many ways, of course, that's I suppose, good news. Have this new job of mental health management of my family, of my staff, and whatnot. That the role that all of us are getting used to in some way or another. And at the same time, of course, we're trying to help others to get through this as much as possible. But then just the regular working schedule. I'm fortunate that my entire team is doing a fantastic job and is working remotely very actively, and so we're as productive as ever. But this time in particular is always extremely busy, just because of fiscal year ends and all kinds of regulatory things coming on top of everything else. So with that, have a great long weekend. If you can get out and do something. Happy Easter, happy Passover, whatever it is you're celebrating, and obviously please do so with all the social distancing in place. Take care.